In Wyoming, there are 400,000 acres of national park called the Bridger Wilderness Area. And there are no roads or buildings or anything like that there. It's just mountains and streams and snow and wild animals. And people go to Bridger to hike, camp, fish, just do all these outdoorsy things. But for some reason, I don't fully understand, Bridger has a place where people can leave comments about their experience in the wilderness. And I want to read some of those comments to you this morning. These were given to the U.S. Forest Service Department at the Bridger Wilderness Area. One person wrote, "There are too many bugs and leeches and spiders and spider webs. Please spray the wilderness to rid the area of these pests." Another person wrote, "Chairlifts need to be in some places so we can get to the wonderful views without having to hike to them." Here's another one. This one's the weirdest one. "A small deer came into my camp and stole my jar of pickles. Is there a way I can get reimbursed? Please call." And then they left their number. "Trails need to be wider so people can walk while holding hands. The coyotes made too much noise last night and kept me awake. Please avoid building trails that go uphill. There are too many rocks in the mountains." And then my favorite, "A McDonald's at the trailhead would be nice." And here's what these comments are saying. Even when we go to the wilderness, even when we go to the mountains, we don't want to experience hard things. We want it to be easier than what it really is. These people are saying there's too much pain from hiking and bugs and steep inclines. And I can just imagine that the park rangers who get these comments think, you are in the wilderness, what do you expect? And while these are funny to laugh at, the truth is that in life, when we go through things we don't want to face, when we experience pain on our own, somebody could always say to us, that's just how life goes. But that doesn't make it better, does it? You see, the reality is that we all go through pain. And so as we continue on our Bloodstained Pews journey this morning, this is what I want to talk about. I want to talk about pain and suffering because they are an unavoidable part of life. The problem is that we're not good at dealing with these things. Now, before I get to scripture for today, as we continue in this series that's all about us getting real and being vulnerable, I want to let you all know that we are officially going to do season 3 of our podcast called Your Story Matters, which we're really excited about. Over the past 2 years, there's been 70 episodes and 75 people from Collective who have sat down to share their stories on the podcast, and we're so excited that it'll be back in 2025. And so first, if you haven't checked out that podcast yet, maybe it's an award-winning podcast. We'll find out in a few weeks, wink, wink. If you haven't checked it out yet, you need to get on it and hear incredible stories about people just being real about life and the highs and lows. But also, if this series has helped you get to a place where you feel like you are ready to share your story, you can sign up. If you open up the Church Center app, there's a button for Your Story Matters. That's the best way to listen to it. But you can also sign up for season 3 as well, because we want to be a church that continues telling stories, and that's one of the best ways that we can do that. And today, we're going to look at the story of a guy named Job. And Job's story is full of suffering, but what really stands out is how he responds to his pain. The beginning of Job's story goes like this. Job is wealthy, he is successful, he has a great family. The Bible says in Job 1 that he trusts God and he stays away from evil. And because of this, Satan hates Job. And because Satan hates Job, he decides to test him because Satan believes that if Job's life falls apart, Job will turn his back on God. And so with God's permission, Satan brings Job all kinds of harm. It starts with a group of messengers showing up at Job's house with devastating news. They tell him all of your cattle and your sheep and your camels, they were stolen or destroyed in a natural disaster. They tell him your livelihood is gone, your servants are gone, and your wealth is gone. And then another messenger shows up and tells him, Job, your kids were all together, they were having a party, and a tornado came through and it destroyed the house they were in. Job, your children have died. In Job chapter 1, verse 20, it says that Job tears his clothes, he shaves his head in grief. But Satan doesn't relent. He takes it to another level. He attacks Job's physical health, and he has boils break out all over his body. And as Job sits in his pain and suffering, he takes pottery and scrapes his skin trying to get some relief. And then to top it all off, While this is happening, Job's wife turns her back on him and tells him that he would be better off if he would just curse God and die. But Job doesn't do that. He continues to trust God. And the next 30 chapters of the book of Job show that his three friends show up, they sit with him in silence for a week, and then they get into a really long conversation about suffering. And so I want to show you 4 lessons from Job about how we need to respond when we experience pain and suffering. And I need to let you all know up front, these 4 lessons will not stop us from experiencing those things, but they will help us have a healthy response when we do. And as a church, culturally, you all do such an incredible job taking notes on Sunday mornings, but if you're not a note taker, please take notes today, because these are the things that you're going to hold on to when life begins to fall apart. The first lesson comes from Job chapter 3. Job says this, starting in verse 3. He says, "Let the day of my birth be erased and the night I was conceived. Let that day be turned to darkness. Let it be lost even to God on high, and let no light shine on it." He continues, he says, "I cannot eat for sighing. My groans pour out like water. What I have always feared has happened to me. What I dreaded has come true. I have no peace, no quietness. I have no rest. Only trouble comes." So we know that Job is suffering. He's experiencing pain. He cries out, "I have no peace." But the thing about Job that we know is true is that Job trusts God. Right? And Jesus says that my peace I will leave with you. And so what Job is saying is, God, I know you. God, I believe in you. But God, I don't feel your peace right now. Now, if you have lived an easy life, this doesn't make any sense to you. But when, not if, right, when you really suffer, this is what it feels like. Everything feels dark. Right? You lose sleep, you lose peace, you feel like your whole world is falling apart. So here's the first lesson from Job. I would encourage you to write this down. Be real about your suffering. That's what Job is doing. He isn't trying to keep it all in. He isn't trying to pretend like everything is okay. He isn't trying to fake it until he makes it. Right? He is being real about his suffering, and we need to do the same thing. Right? Be real about your suffering. And this sounds obvious, but the thing is, we suck at this. And some Christians even try to act like suffering shouldn't happen. Right? They act surprised by it or offended by it, or they say things like, "Why is this happening to me?" And here's why this is happening to you. Because you are a human and you live in a fallen world. Right? That's it. If Jesus, the one perfect person to ever exist, had to suffer, you will have to suffer. Nietzsche said it like this: to live is to suffer. And listen, that's not doom and gloom, and that's not like a bad perspective look at life. That's just a realistic look at how life goes. Schutt Sports is one of the helmet suppliers for the NFL, and they put a warning label on all of their helmets that says this. It says, "Warning, no helmet system can prevent concussions or eliminate the risk of serious head or neck injuries while playing football." And then the warning label goes on to list all the things that can happen to you while you are playing football, even while wearing their helmet. And it concludes with this. They said, "To avoid these risks, do not engage in the sport of football." Right? They want to make it clear, if you play football, you will get hurt. And I think as humans, we need to be reminded, if you are a human, you will get hurt. And I have to warn you, because there are distorted versions of Christianity that don't talk about this. There are distorted versions of Christianity that don't teach this. Over the past few years, there's been a trend in Christianity that's known as the emotional prosperity gospel. And I'm sure you all know of regular prosperity gospel stuff, right? It's that preacher that's on TV late at night, and it's like, if you send me $100, God will answer your prayers. Like, send me $100, maybe God will answer your prayers for more money. You can do that. But that's mostly died out today, unless I guess you're up at 2 o'clock in the morning. But what we have today in Christian culture is something much more insidious. And so going through Instagram or going on YouTube, there are countless clips of Christian pastors and influencers talking about peace. They're talking about victory in Jesus. They're talking about overcoming. And the problem is this: everything they say is true, but they don't say everything that is true. Now let me say that again. Everything they say is true, but they don't say everything that is true. Meaning you won't hear these bloggers or preachers or authors talk about pain or suffering. They don't talk about grief or picking up your cross or sometimes that life is just hard. They don't share the story of Job. Right? The core of the message of the emotional prosperity gospel is this: with Jesus, life gets better, and that's it. Right? And they say things like the pain you are feeling can't compare to the joy that is coming. Right? There's no promise that on the other side of pain that there is joy, except for Jesus. Right? They say things like your tragedy will be your victory. Sometimes it's just your tragedy. They say things like a miracle is on the way. You can't promise that. And all of these platitudes sound really good. They just don't work in a funeral home. They don't work when you find out that he's had an affair. They don't work when you've been laid off. And so as Christians, if we are going to live the authentic biblical life, we have to be real about our suffering and real about our pain. We cannot pretend like everything is okay just because we follow Jesus. Right? Sometimes it's faith and pain, faith and grief, faith and suffering. And we need to be real about that. Now here's the second lesson from Job. In his suffering, Job says this in Job 16. He says, my eyes are red with weeping, dark shadows circle my eyes. Some of you know exactly what Job is describing right here. Right? You have stayed up all night crying before. You've cried to the point where there are no tears. You've cried so much that it hurts. In Job 6, he says, oh, that I might have my request, that God would grant my desire. I wish he would crush me. I wish he would reach out his hand and kill me. When you read this, you can feel Job's pain. It is a physical pain. It is an emotional pain. It's a pain worse than what he could ever imagine. Right? That's why he says to God, I don't want to exist anymore. I don't want to be here anymore. That's why he says, God, I just want to die. And I know that many of you have been in that place before. So here's the second lesson to write down. You need to be real about what suffering does inside of you. Right? You need to be real about what suffering does inside of you. That's what Job is doing. Last spring, I was building some shelves in my garage, and I ran my hand along one of the 2x4s, and I got multiple splinters in my palm. And so at first, I just tried to use my fingernails to pull them out. It didn't really work, so I grabbed some tweezers, and I pulled out the rest. But the next morning, my palm was red. It was tender, minor pain, but I just assumed it was from having splinters in it the day before. Over the next few days, the pain grew worse. It got redder and redder. It felt more tender and tender. It was so bad I began to compensate, use my left hand to do things like brush my teeth or open my doors. I didn't want to use my right hand because I didn't want to feel that pain. A few days after the splinters, there was clearly something wrong, and so I took my hand, I soaked it in warm water, and I took my thumb and I pushed against the red spot as hard as I could and outshot a splinter, as well as some blood and some ooze. I know that's gross. That's just the reality. The splinter was so deep that I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. And when we refuse to be real about what suffering does inside of us, it's a lot like a splinter that sits under the skin. It brings more pain and more infection, and it impacts how we live. You have to be real about how the grief is impacting your mental health. You have to be real about how the pain from the divorce has hardened your heart, and now you have trust issues. You have to be real about how the suffering from the diagnosis took away your desire to get out of bed in the morning. Because if we don't share about the pain we are experiencing and how it is hurting us, it's like an infection that spreads to other areas of our lives. And this will hurt our marriages, our self-worth, our trust, our faith. So it's not just being real about pain, it's about being real about how that pain is hurting us and impacting those things that matter the most to us. Here's the third lesson. As Job is ranting and crying out to God and having this conversation, his friends are interjecting. And what we learn from this long conversation between Job and his friends is this: be real with others. Be real with others. And here's what makes this application so hard, though. Sometimes other people don't make it better. In fact, sometimes people make it worse. Really, that's what happened to Job. In Job 12, he gets in a fight with his friends. He says, you people really know everything, don't you? He says, and when you die, wisdom will die with you. Well, I know a few things myself, and you're no better than I am. Who doesn't know these things you've been saying? Right? In Job 16, he pushes back again. He says, I've heard all this before. What miserable comforters you are. Won't you ever stop blowing hot air? What makes you keep on talking? And the thing is, his friends are giving him bad advice. Really what they're doing is they're giving him bad theology. They're telling him not to trust God, to turn away from God. They're giving him bad comfort. Right? People say stupid things when you are suffering. I want to share with you, and this is especially to the Christian people here, a do not say list for when people around you go through the hardest thing they've ever experienced. If you're not taking notes, please take notes about this, right? Don't say, people have been through worse. Right? Don't say, I guess God needed them in heaven. Don't say, it must have been God's will. Right? Don't ever say, everything happens for a reason. Christians love that one. Don't say you just need to move on. Don't say God never gives you more than you can handle. Because you know what people think who are going through their worst thing when you tell them that God never gives you more than that they can handle? They want to respond, yes, he does. Right? He's doing that in my life right now. This is more than I can handle, and I'm absolutely crushed. I feel like Job. I want to die. I can't handle this. Right? Don't say these things. Right? If you say these things, stop saying these things. If you've ever said these things to anybody, apologize to them for saying these things. The Bible actually gives people who follow Jesus really clear instructions on what to do when someone is weeping. We weep. When someone is mourning, we mourn. And that's it. Because there's nothing that we can say that will really make them feel better. The few things I have been told that help people if you just can't help yourself and you need to say something is I love you, I'm here for you, we're praying for you. But if you just weep with them, that's good. Right? And the point is, be real with others. And here's why. It builds community. When you go through hard things and you're real with others, it builds community. And yes, it is a risk because they might try to fix you, and they can't. And they might say some dumb things that don't actually have any true meaning. But when you're real with others on some level, it makes you feel close to them, and they feel close to you, and you realize that you are not alone. The thing is, it doesn't make the pain go away. But it reminds you that there is a safe place for you to be sad and angry and everything in between. Right? This is why we talk all the time here at Collective that you have to have a crew of people. Right? This tight group of 3 to 5 people where you can be your best self and your worst self. Because when the thing happens where you can't breathe, where you just want to die, you need people. This is why I'm so proud of many of you, because this week in our small groups, we asked you to do a really risky thing and share a truth that you don't want other people to know about you. And some of you went home, you got in touch with your 3 to 5 people, your crew, and you let them know something that you didn't want to share. But some of you did it in your small group with people that are not much more than strangers. And I know this made you nervous, but you went for it, and you experienced community that comes when you take risks. You have to be real about your suffering with others. Now, here's the last lesson. Right? Job is honest and real with his friends, but he's also honest and real with God. Job 16, he says, "Oh God, you have ground me down and devastated my family." Here's what Job's doing. He's venting to God. He's yelling at God. He's crying out to God. He says, "God hates me and angrily tears me apart. He snaps his teeth at me and pierces me with his eyes. For he attacks me with a storm and repeatedly wounds me without cause. He will not let me catch my breath, but fills me instead with bitter sorrows." He says, "I cry to you, O God, but you don't answer. I stand before you, but you don't even look." These are some really strong words for God. But here's a lesson for us in this. Be real with God. Be real with God. Job, the book of Job, and Job specifically, has something in common with the book of Psalms that's also in the Old Testament. Because in the Psalms, you find everything. You find joy, you find sadness, you find anger, you find suffering. It's all there. And I think it's all there to teach us that all of this stuff inside of us, we need to bring to God. Because God is big enough to handle our heartache and our anger and our questions. He's big enough to handle our grief and our pain and our problems. And I would even go beyond that to say that he desires them. He wants us to share these things. And notice with the stuff I talked about with Job, it doesn't make Job feel better. And God doesn't actually give him answers, but the result is this: he knows that God is with him. In fact, he grows closer to God through his vulnerability with God. And so we need to be real with God. And that can happen through prayer, through journaling, through just being alone and sitting in silence in nature. It can be through yelling at God and pacing in your backyard. Just be real with God because he desires it from you. Now, each week in this series, we have shared a story from our church. And I want to give you a heads up this morning because the story we're about to share is a really tough one. But there are 2 reasons I want you to hear this. And the first is this: Jess and Cole know God. And the second is this: Jess and Cole know pain.
Our daughter Maggie was born on May 11th, 2023. We were really excited for her arrival, in particular because we felt like she would really blend our family. It'd be something we would all share together. Around Christmas of 2022, we went in for a scan to find out the gender. And we were real excited because we had planned to tell the kids. It was almost like an early Christmas gift to tell them, whether they were going to have a brother or a sister. The sonographer had a hard time locating Maggie, or at least locating her in the right position to determine the gender. So we left the appointment feeling a little disappointed, I think.
We didn't really feel anything was wrong at that point. It was more just like this sadness that we couldn't, bring the baby into like our Christmas celebration.
We didn't even really take note of the fact that during the scan, the sonographer really wasn't saying a whole lot. Shortly after that appointment, we got a phone call from your midwife, and they informed us that there was some signs of severe neurological abnormalities.
It was a gut punch. So after Christmas, there were some more tests because they wanted to confirm what they were seeing, and the only thing they were saying was like, your baby's going to die.
I think the biggest thing we clung to was her name.
This is our daughter. Her name is Maggie. Her middle name is Hope. And we just decided to keep fighting.
Yep.
I made it to the second trimester. And once we got to the third trimester, that's when a lot of our doctors and our midwife was like, okay, you might have a full-term baby, so we really need to talk about what birth is going to look like. We've heard this so much, and other parents, especially mothers who have carried with life-limiting diagnosis, you're so strong, you're incredible, like we don't know how you're putting one foot in front of the other. And those are true and those are encouraging, but we also just didn't have a choice. And I really wanted to have a choice. We made it to the weekend before her due date, and then we made it to her due date, and she was born on her due date. Like, yeah, look what she did. She made it.
She did, yeah.
When we got to the hospital, her heart was really strong. Her heartbeat was exactly what it was supposed to look like, and I was healthy, exactly what I was supposed to look like. And then in the last 2 hours of birth, her heart gave up.
I just remember her, her being born, and they put her on your chest, and you had like a peace, but it wrecked me. And I just remember looking at her, and she was so peaceful and perfect, but at the same time knowing that I would never get to know her, I would never hold her hand, I would never teach her how to ride a bike, I would never talk her through difficult circumstances, and that just shattered me in that moment.
The pain settled in pretty quickly. That afternoon, we left the hospital empty-handed. She was born just a few days before Mother's Day last year, so that weekend, just a little over 24 hours after her being born, we had to go to the funeral home and have conversations. And there's only a few miles between our house and that funeral home, and we drove it so many times that we call it Maggie's Walk, because we often will walk. And saw her one last time on Mother's Day. And that was it.
You think about sort of the last time you see our earthly bodies a certain way, but then when you're looking at your child, it's completely, even though that she's already been healed, and that there's nothing left to do here on earth, there's still this like heartache and sorrow that comes from knowing this is the last time you're going to look at her, how she is.
The feeling of losing Maggie happened right after she was born when we left the hospital. And I remember in the days and the week after we came home, after she died, I said that to you. I was like, it feels like she's gone. It feels like she doesn't exist. There are times where she just doesn't feel real. And so talking about Maggie, sharing her story, as difficult as it can be, and we're still learning how to share it, it just means that she just becomes more real.
That's been huge. And for me, it's gone from something I didn't really know how to talk about, something I didn't even really want to talk about, to be honest, to something I didn't really know how to talk about, to now like something I'm excited to talk about. Like, I'm excited to talk about, that was Maggie's dad. I am Maggie's dad.
The way that grief and pain ebb and flow, and they come so unexpectedly, and I didn't anticipate the anger that I feel just in life in general, but also toward God. And it's something that I'm actively working through and spending time in.
That's the interesting thing with pain, I think, and that's the hope of pain, is that it changes us, right? Like, for me, it's completely changed me. I mean, I'll never be the same. I think it's made me a more empathetic person, more understanding. I just see things completely differently, and I'm able to enter into these relationships and understanding with people who've walked the same path that I never would have been able to enter into in the same way.
So I'd much rather have Maggie here with us than to share a story like this, but because this is our story, and because of Maggie, we get to sit in a place that can be compassionate and empathetic and connected to other people who are experiencing similar pain.
So I think when we talk about the hope for eternity, there's the verse, what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, really comes really to the forefront for me. And he says, that is why we never give up. Though our bodies are dying, our spirits are being renewed every day. For our present troubles are small and won't last very long, yet they produce for us a glory that vastly outweighs them and will last forever. So we don't look at the troubles we can see now, rather we fix our gaze on things that cannot be seen. For the things we see now will soon be gone, but the things we cannot see will last forever.
Can we give it up for Cole and Jess for sharing their story? I want to end this morning by talking to those of you who are suffering right now. Because in the story, Job says all these things and God shows up. But God does not answer his questions. God does not bring his kids back to life. God doesn't actually make him feel better, but God is present. And when you are real with yourself and with others and with God, things might not immediately get better, but you will not be alone. Which is why Job can say this with confidence, even in his suffering. In Job 19, he says, but as for me, I know that my Redeemer lives, and he will stand upon the earth at last. And after my body has decayed, yet in my body I will see God. I will see him for myself. Yes, I will see him with my own eyes. I am overwhelmed at the thought. And what Job is saying is, he's saying, one day when I die, I will go to heaven. And I will be with God forever. And all of this pain and suffering will be gone. And that is our great hope. And when we are real about suffering, we are real about the facts that sometimes it will not get better this side of heaven. I don't know if you know this, but George H.W. Bush had a daughter who passed away from cancer when she was 3 years old. In his biography, the president writes that he could not talk about his daughter without without physically crying until he was in his 80s. And I don't know, but this is just a hunch. I think that George knew in his 80s, because of his faith in Jesus, he was close to heaven and close to seeing his daughter again. And so to those of you who suffer, Jesus sees you. I said earlier, our response, our command when we're around people who are suffering is to weep. And it's not just our command, it's our example. Because when Jesus goes to his best friend's funeral, that's what he did. Jesus wept. Jesus sees you. He weeps with you. He knows what it feels like to be abandoned. He knows what it feels like to suffer. He knows what it's like to pray to God the most intense and honest prayer that's ever prayed and get nothing back. So if you don't know Jesus, really I'm saying if you don't have hope, will you please give your life to him? Because the hope that comes from Jesus transcends all of these circumstances. He doesn't promise that he will make life better. Life is suffering. But he says, I will be with you through the storm, and I'll bring you to heaven one day. So if you don't know Jesus, all you know is pain and suffering, you want to be able to live the way that people like Cole and Jess live, it starts with him. We would encourage you to check the baptism box in your connection card. Go ahead and next steps, talk to somebody. Turn away from the path you are on. Turn toward Jesus. Because if you don't, there is no hope. There's nothing this world is coming to offer to give that to us. That's why Jess and Cole talk so much about it. That's why they talked so much about hope. And I know that it can be hard to understand how the pain and suffering they have experienced and are still feeling today, it is hard to understand how that can lead to hope. But it's because their hope doesn't come from this world. Comes from Jesus. It's the hope of heaven. It's the hope of resurrection. And it's the hope of eternity with God. Let's pray. God, I think it's safe to say that every single person sitting in this room understands pain. God, that we understand suffering. The problem is we feel like we're not allowed to feel that way. Or God, the problem is we feel like we're supposed to shove it down. Especially those of us who have spent time in the church and spent time following you. We feel like we're not allowed to talk about our pain and suffering because everything needs to be good and everything needs to be joy and everything needs to be perfect. But God, we understand the reality that this world is not perfect and there is pain and there is suffering. God, instead of shoving it deep down inside and pretending like everything's okay, God, I pray that we can be more like Job. God, I pray that we have the confidence to cry out. God, I pray that we have the courage to share what's killing us on the inside with people that we love. God, I pray that we feel close enough to you to yell at you about the things that we are struggling with. God, I pray that we can be real about the pain that we feel. God, I know there are people here that feel exactly the way Job does right now. That is their life. And God, I pray more than anything else that they feel the hope of eternity with you. God, that they understand that this world is broken and messed up and imperfect, and it'll be full of pain and suffering until the day we die. But God, you give us the opportunity to spend eternity with you in heaven where there is no more pain, where there are no more tears, where everything is made new and everything is good. God, I pray that we find our hope in that. God, help us understand that life is suffering, but there is hope that can only be found in you. God, we thank you and love you and pray these things in your name. Amen.